are in listen-only mode.
Hello, my name's Giles Parkinson. I'm the editor of Climate Spectator. Welcome to today's webinar on international climate policy, which is sponsored by Shell. And apologies for the slightly delayed start. We just had a few technical issues, which are now resolved, we presume. Look, I'm going to be your host today, and we've been joined by two excellent panelists. We have Erwin Jackson, the Deputy CEO of the Climate Institute, and Martijn Wilder, the Head of Climate Change Policy at Baker McKenzie. Before we go into the, before we introduce those two guys, it's not an open audio session, so if you want to ask a question, and please do, you use the webinar control panel and ask a question there. First of all, we will start with Erwin, who's going to give us a presentation about the recent climate talks which he attended. And then we'll follow that with Martijn Wilder speaking about the climate change policy as well. He was also in Durban, and they're two of the best policy analysts we have. So, Erwin, welcome to the webinar. I'm going to hand over to you if you can take us through the slides.
Thanks, Giles. I'm assuming everyone can hear me. So if I could have the first slide, that'd be great. So as Giles mentioned, I was in Durban for the last few weeks. So what I thought I'd do today is give a bit of context to the talks, run through quickly what the major decisions were made in Durban, talk a little bit about the implications of what was decided, and then give some reflections at the end about what it means for both the climate change talks more generally and Australian climate policy. So we can go to the next slide. So I thought, as a way of introduction, I think there was a few things I thought were important. The first was that sometimes people think of the climate change negotiations as probably not in the right way. So, for example, when we negotiated Kyoto in 1997, it was environment ministers sitting in a room negotiating an environment treaty. That's not really what's happening anymore. When we go to the international climate change negotiations, we're not only seeing environment ministers turn up. The chief negotiator of the Chinese delegation is the head of their most powerful economics agency. So what we're seeing now at the climate negotiations is not just an environment treaty. We're seeing a negotiation which is cutting across very complex issues of trade, economics, and in many cases, for many countries, their national security interests. So the talks have become much more complex, and that's reflected in the fact that the outcomes in Durban were, over 130 pages long. The other thing that's generally happened in the climate change negotiations is people have generally judged their outcome or the outcome of a meeting based on whether it achieves a treaty or not. And that has tended to overlook some of the real practical progress that has been made at an international level. And a good example of that is what happened in Copenhagen, where there was broad expectations in the media that a treaty would be negotiated and agreed in Copenhagen. However, that wasn't the expectation of governments, most governments, or analysts who were close to the process. So what we saw from Copenhagen was the media portrayed it as a failure because it didn't deliver a treaty. Now, that's not to say Copenhagen wasn't disappointing, and it was certainly chaotic and had its problems. But it did achieve a couple of key things that have tended to be overlooked. For example, in Copenhagen, for the first time, we saw countries which represent 80% of global emissions committing internationally to take action. So the point I'm trying to make here is just because a meeting doesn't achieve a treaty doesn't mean it can't make practical progress. The third thing to say is that the dynamics of the international negotiations have really changed quite a lot since the negotiation of the Kyoto Protocol. When we negotiated the protocol in 1997, we actually had very little domestic action happening at a global level, with some exceptions, of course, in Europe, where the first carbon taxes had emerged, and other clean energy policies. But most countries were acting for other reasons, particularly energy security reasons. Now we're in a very different world where we have a broad base of action across all major economies. Some very significant, some less so, but nevertheless we are actually seeing action across all economies, which has meant that, and that's been happening in the absence of a legally binding treaty that's covered all major emitters. So what we are seeing, we've moved from a world where a treaty comes first and then countries take action to a world where we're actually seeing international negotiations happening on an ongoing basis and countries acting at the same time. And that action is not being driven by a feel-good desire to protect the environment. And that's probably my third point, is that countries are acting really out of their economic self-interest. They're acting because they see the advantages of reducing imports of foreign oil, reducing the impacts of air pollution, building new clean energy industries to position themselves to the inevitability of strong international action in a low-carbon economy, and also because countries recognise the need to act on climate change. So that's happening, as I said, as I've already mentioned, in advance of an international treaty. The next slide. So what was agreed in Durban, and what I've got here on this slide are really the headlines. So the Durban platform, which is really the headline outcome, was an agreement to negotiate legally binding commitments for major economies by 2015. Now that's the first time that's ever happened in the history of the negotiations, which I'll come to in a little while, which, while it is an agreement to negotiate, and some people in the press have suggested just a process to keep talking, it is much more significant than that, which I'll talk about in the next slide. Alongside that, we had a range of other decisions. You can see here in the orange the decisions that were made under what's called the long-term, the ad hoc working group on long-term cooperative action. That was the process that was launched in Bali in 2007. We saw that in some respects culminate in the Cancun agreements that were agreed last year in Cancun, and there was a decision in Durban to end that negotiating track in the end of next year. So and underneath that negotiating track, you've got a range of decisions that are being made around mitigation or pollution reductions, and that's really focused at both developed and developing countries and countries are doing, how you review what countries are doing, and how you capture the commitments that countries are making at a domestic and international level under a common framework. You've also there got international financing, and I've underlined the Green Climate Fund there. In Copenhagen, we had a commitment that industrialised countries would facilitate $100 billion of investment in adaptation and clean technology and clean energy deployment in developing countries by 2020. In Cancun, we saw an agreement to establish the Green Fund, the Global Climate Fund, and then that was really stood up in Durban, which is one of the more significant outcomes. From here, we'll also see a negotiation about what sources of financing will we use to go into the Green Fund and happen alongside the Green Fund, the Climate Fund. We also saw some decisions on adaptation and technology cooperation, which have set up various bodies to help developing countries adapt to the impacts of climate change and to facilitate technology cooperation. I've separated out here also the other element of what was agreed in Durban or fleshed out, or part of the Cancun agreements that was fleshed out in Durban, which is the 2013-2015 review. Now this is important because it's also linked to the outcomes of the Durban platform. What we're going to see in 2013 to 2015 is an international review of the level of action that is happening at a global level and whether it is sufficient to achieve the goals that countries have set, in particular to avoid a 2-degree increase in global temperature. And there's a view that that goal may be strengthened to avoid an increase of 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. So, and that will be important because that will feed into another number of key decision-making points both domestically in Australia, but also it will also be the time when countries will start to consider what their targets are post-2020. On the other side, we also saw an agreement which effectively concludes negotiations around the next commitment period under the Kyoto Protocol. So in and that's in the grey. So by May next year, countries who are Kyoto parties who want to submit targets will submit a target to what they think their next commitment period target will be. That commitment period will either be a 5-year commitment period lasting until 2017, or my assessment is more likely until 2020. that will then be finalised, and that final target will be finalised and ready for ratification at the next meeting in Qatar next year. Also, they finalised many of the major rules that will work under the next commitment period in Durban. For example, how land use change and forestry accounting will work. There is one outstanding issue on the rules, which is how many units countries can carry over into the next commitment period. For example, Australia will exceed its target, would have international assigned amount units it can potentially sell and carry over into its next commitment period. So there's some outstanding AUs can be carried over. So I'll go to the next slide. So I just wanted to just talk a bit about the significance of the 2015 agreement to negotiate a new treaty. So what I've got at the top there is the UNFCCC, which is the framework convention that was agreed in 1992. Now that covers commitments for all economies, but at the time it did not have any legally binding pollution target commitments. There were voluntary commitments that countries were making to reduce emissions, but there weren't any binding commitments. That then, in 1995, then we saw the Berlin Mandate, and that mandate effectively said that by 1997 we would agree a protocol or other legal instrument that would capture the commitments of developed countries, and that then led to the Kyoto Protocol and its subsequent first commitment period. Now, in that situation, you've actually got around 25% of emissions, global emissions, covered because, as we all know, the US didn't sign up. Now, that of course isn't sustainable in the long term because you can't have one group of countries just covered by legally binding commitments because A, it's not environmentally effective, and as we see in the political debate here in Australia, but it also plays out in the US, Japan, Canada and every other major industrialised country, politically it's unsustainable over the longer term to have differentiated commitments between developed and developing countries in terms of the legality of the commitments that they're taking on. But what we also saw in 2007 was the launching of the Bali Action Plan, which effectively created another track of negotiations. So from Bali through to Durban, you've effectively seen a two-track process where you've had discussion around legally binding commitments on a small range of countries under the Kyoto Protocol, with voluntary commitments that have emerged for the other major emitters, the US, China, India and Brazil. Now what the Durban platform effectively does is from 2020, after that treaty is negotiated, all parties will be sitting in the same room negotiating their commitments. That will be more economically efficient, but it will also be important in terms of the dynamics and the politics of the meeting, so that they will be looking each other in the eye effectively as they're negotiating their commitments. And of course the big difference between that and Kyoto was that now we're covering 80+% of global emissions. So I'll go to the next slide. So some of the implications. Well, first of all, probably the main one is because Australia has passed the Clean Energy Future Package, it has the ability to meet any targets it commits to internationally. So while we're well positioned to meet our current commitments under the Cancun Accords, and we're also well legally binding treaty. Some other countries are in a similar position. EU with its emissions trading system is similarly well placed. China, because of the policies it's putting in place through its various 5-year plans, is also reasonably well positioned. However, if we have a change in government, that situation will change because, as we know, the coalition's policy is to repeal the emissions trading system. Under their current policy, it's hard to see them to be able to meet any of the targets that Australia is committed to internationally, and indeed the targets the coalition supports. This will become particularly pointy if Australia takes on a second commitment period under the Kyoto Protocol, because the land use change and forestry rules that are agreed under the protocol for the next commitment period would effectively rule out the coalition using soil carbon. So that again would make it very difficult for the coalition to meet any of its international, for a coalition government to meet the international obligations. The other thing to say about Durban is that it continues to redefine the global politics of the climate change negotiations. In Copenhagen, we saw for the first time the emerging split in the G77 and China group. In the past, we'd always seen a negotiation where the G77 and China would be really standing up against what is now called the Umbrella Group, which is the US, Japan, Canada, Australia, and the non-European industrialised countries, with the European countries sitting somewhere in the middle trying to broker a deal. Now what we're seeing increasingly is smaller countries within G77 standing up to India and China and Brazil and South Africa and saying, hold on guys, our national interest and indeed the survival of our entire country is at stake here. We need you to be acting as well as the developed world. So we wouldn't have got the dynamic, we wouldn't have got the outcome in Durban we've got if that dynamic didn't exist. For example, because basically what happened in the end game of Durban was you had India isolated amongst the bigger major emitters, saying it wasn't prepared to accept a legally binding treaty agreed by 2015. Then with the EU, with support from the Alliance of Small Island States and some of the other smaller developing countries and the most vulnerable developing countries, basically saying to India, "Hold, come on, you know, this is not just about you, this is about all of us, and we need you to agree." And that then led to ultimately the agreement that we got in Durban. So what we're actually seeing is a new ambition coalition emerging. We're seeing the EU, AOSIS, the LDCs, and some countries in Africa forming sort of, if you like, a block of countries which is pushing the other major emitters to take more action, and that's particularly important for the basic countries in China, India and Brazil. Now the other issue that's going to continue to emerge as a result of that, in part because as a result of that ambition coalition, is there's going to be a lot of pressure on countries to increase their ambition before 2020. And that will come through both the 2013-2015 review, but it could come as early as next year. I think there's a broad expectation with the Danish presidency in the EU that the target that the EU puts forward in May for its new Kyoto target may not be its 20% target. There's a reasonable chance that it will put forward a target that is higher than 20%, either 25% or even its 30% target. And that will have implications for the global carbon market, but it will also be important for the EU in terms of the geopolitics to actually show good faith in terms of its showing that it's continuing to work proactively with the smaller developing states. Which then, of course, raises a question about what Australia does. Whether Australia puts in a new Kyoto target in May, what that target will be. Would it be the 5%, or would it be a target which is more in line with what other countries are doing, i.e. about 10 to 15%? Then there's a broader question which is related to that about what, and if that target is put in place under the Kyoto Protocol, and what implications that would have for the Climate Change Authority's deliberations in 2014 and the target that it puts in place for our domestic emissions trading scheme. And I'll leave it at that.
Terrific. Thanks very much for that, Erwin. And I've got a couple of questions I'd like to pose immediately. But first of all, we're going to pass over to Martijn Wilder, the head of the climate change practice at Baker McKenzie. Can you give us your thoughts, Martijn?
Yeah, sure, Giles. I think, as Erwin has said, is that the clear outcome of Durban is significant, particularly in the way that what it really does is it creates an umbrella framework under which domestic action is going to continue to go along. And I think if you think of what would have been the outcome if this didn't happen, I mean, if there was no international agreement at all of any kind, and there was not some in principle framework to go forward and other countries buying in, we would have probably, in that sense, had significant uncertainty, and we would have had no framework for it going forward, and countries would very much have been operating on their own domestically. So it is significant in the sense that, despite it's a long way off, it does set this sort of global architecture under which most of the domestic country will action, and governments can have some sort of argument to say that part of the reason we're taking domestic action is because we do have these sort of ongoing international commitments. So I think that's sort of very important from a symbolic perspective. Although it is true that, I think as Erwin said, we really have an agreement to an agree here. And you know, if you're advising a client on what legally that means, you'd say, well, that really doesn't give you anything legally. But I think at an international law perspective, you know, international agree actually are critically important. But one of the big issues, I guess, and this is just really what I'm going to touch on before we go to questions, is how has the market really reacted to this, and what does it mean for market certainty? So what's particularly interesting is that while there's been an agreement to sort of extend Kyoto on the part of some countries, the exact nature of that extension needs to be determined over the next 12 months, and then there'll sort of be some conclusion on that. So if we're in the European market, while initially the market price did increase, over the last sort of 48 hours, the CERs have hit an all-time low of €4, or €4.42 if you're buying spot. EUAs are down to about 7. There is, under the EU rules about buying CERs, there's a reliance on the need for an international agreement to be in place. Otherwise, you need a bilateral agreement between countries to get CERs, and there's a lot of uncertainty within Europe whether this package forms an international agreement that triggers that domestic threshold, and the general view is it doesn't. There's uncertainty about the continuance of the CDM, and what's interesting is that, I mean, legally speaking, and there's a lot of people who I think have misunderstood this, is that the Kyoto Protocol itself always continued. The only way for the protocol to end would be for all of the countries to withdraw it and in the treaty. But the mechanisms of Kyoto would have continued regardless of the outcome of Durban. The question then would have been, if you didn't have a second commitment period, how does the certain mechanics like the CDM and JI, etc., work in the absence of a second commitment period? So what we do have now is an agreement by some countries, notably Europe, to definitively have a second commitment period, but and there is the assumption that the CDM will continue, and there's nothing within the international framework that says that the CDM will not continue in the absence of a second commitment period. So the ability is now for the CDM to refer to CERs issued in a second commitment period, because that has been agreed to by some countries. So irrespective of Durban, it's interesting that the CDM will now, as it was going to in any event, continue, and the demand will be under the domestic schemes. What is interesting is that the draft text at Durban, midway through the conference on the CDM, did give you a number of options, and one of those options was the parties will agree to continue the CDM. Another one was the parties will agree to continue the CDM only if Kyoto's extended, or the parties will not agree to continue the CDM. That text ultimately was not adopted, but decisions, it is still possible over the next 12 months for countries to think about, will the CDM operate and will CERs be eligible, and how will that play out? Now, this is particularly relevant in the Australian context, because under the emissions trading scheme in Australia, when you come to the flexible period and we can use these sorts of units, there are questions about to what extent can Australia generate ERUs and sell them internationally. Well, we probably can't if we're not part of a second commitment period. We can probably accept any units into the country, but in terms of exporting, there's great uncertainty around that. So I think while at a policy level the developments are critical and they are positive and they're very important, there still remains a little bit of market uncertainty, and so I think the focus will continue to be, as it has been, on the development of domestic emissions trading schemes, particularly in light of what China's doing and others are developing. And then just two other sort of quite interesting developments out of all of this is that, one, what we have seen is in the case of Norway have obviously agreed to a commitment. They're also, at the moment, there's internal lobbying going on in Norway to increase the level of permits they can buy from the CDM from 30 to 60%, because they want to get cheaper sources of abatement. And then secondly, I guess in the case of Canada, obviously with Canada withdrawing from the Kyoto Protocol, just so that people are aware, the way that it works is that 3 years after the protocol comes into force, you can lodge an instrument to withdraw from the protocol. It then takes a year before it takes effect. So Canada's withdrawal will occur before the end of the first commitment period, which means they won't be subject to the penalty. So what Canada's really been saying is that the amount of penalty we have to pay as a government for being in Kyoto, because we won't meet our target, is so significant that it's not financially worth us doing. We'll still continue to meet and work towards our Cancun target, and our Copenhagen commitment, but we're not going to be part of the Kyoto process. And so that just sort of obviously does have it takes a little bit of the political momentum out of Kyoto, but legally we have seen that Europeans have committed to an extension of Kyoto, whereas the Australians have done it on a conditional basis with everybody else agreeing. So I think from a market perspective, what's happened at Durban, to be totally frank about it, has in many ways is positive in the sense that it does create this sort of international momentum, but I don't think it's made that much difference to market certainty. In fact, we're going to be waiting another year for many decisions to be made, and certainly in the European context, and particularly the Australian ETS, there are some significant questions that remain about participation in these international frameworks. And I think again the focus is going to be more on domestic. There's been sort of talking about in their discussions with New Zealand and the Europeans. So I'll end it there.
Well, okay, look, thank you very much for that. Thank you very much for that, Martijn. I apologise if my voice is faint. I'm going to try and shout a bit. If you want to ask a question, just use the control panel, type it in, and it will come up on my screen, and I will throw them over to Martijn and to Erwin. I've got a question first off, and it goes to Erwin and possibly Martijn as well. But Erwin, you talked about this review period. One of the interpretations of Durban is that basically they put off this whole decision for a decade. Nothing will be decided by 2020. But what you seem to be suggesting is that there is a potential for people to actually ramp up their targets in the interim and therefore have more ambition and presumably act to reduce that gigaton gap. Is that right?
Well, that's right. So because the treaty would be agreed in 2015, and it was also agreed in Durban that the process would increase the level of ambition that countries take on. Now, whether the United States, for example, will take on more ambition, at this point is probably a bit of a call. They don't have a sort of a national legislative framework to allow them to do that, despite the fact that they are regulating on their power stations and their vehicles and so forth. So there's questions about whether China would do it as well, and that sort of remains to be seen, because what effectively China is doing is building the domestic policy frameworks that it needs to be able to meet international commitments. It's building the confidence that it needs to be able to commit internationally by putting in place those frameworks. And it may, in its next 5-year plan, be in a position to increase its ambition. That's pretty hard to say. But that said, you do have opportunities in countries like the EU and Australia, because they have the domestic policy frameworks in place to increase ambition at low cost. So there will be political pressure, I think, on both of those countries to do that. I think the other point to make, which is related to all of this, is that the fact that we've got an international agreement to negotiate a treaty really highlights how comfortable countries are now with their domestic policy frameworks. In fact, because countries have been acting domestically, in some respects that's allowing them the confidence to actually start the process to negotiate an international treaty. And we've never seen that before. So you're getting this dynamics happening within the process of domestic policy making happening, which is allowing countries to be more ambitious internationally and vice versa.
Okay. Martijn, maybe I can just try the next question.
No, I totally agree with that.
Okay. Well, good. Okay, I'm going to ask a question from Chester. Martijn, I might put it to you. This is just a technical question about the Kyoto period finishes in 2017, and does that leave a 3-year gap? My understanding is that that's not actually resolved when the second period will end. Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah, it's not actually resolved, and there was a number of governments calling yesterday that period should in fact be 2020. So I think in the text itself it's actually bracketed as to when it would be, and that's a decision which they will make over the coming 12 months.
Okay, and maybe I can just follow up with another question from Simon, and it goes back to what was being said about the signing of the Kyoto target. Canada has withdrawn. Australia has not yet said whether it will sign. What's the significance of that? And if I understood you rightly, Australia does not sign the Kyoto, then it cannot access the CDM, but it may be able to have a bilateral agreement with another country. Is that right?
Well, with respect to, sorry, I think there are a few questions in there. So, so with respect to the CDM, no, I mean a lot of this is quite untested, so we don't really know yet. I mean, our view is that Australia has agreed to include CERs within the flexible period of our legislation. So therefore, to the extent that they exist, we can continue to use them. I think that the link between the CDM and the second commitment period, obviously in Australia's case, isn't there. So we are technically a party to an international agreement, which is the Kyoto Protocol. We have certain obligations under that, but which don't include at this point in time a second commitment period. But those obligations do include various reporting and other obligations, and we are able to access and still fund and participate in the CDM, and we are able to generate credits under the CDM and have them transferred into our registry account. It's just that once they're transferred here, then domestic law will apply and they'll only be used for domestic purposes. But I think a lot of those issues really are, that's the prima facie position, but how it will actually work, and we'll have to wait and see how things pan out.
In terms of the question on Canada, I think the key issue with Canada and its withdrawal from the KP is really around it just erodes confidence in international processes amongst many countries, and it will be used as an excuse over and over again from those major developing countries who don't want to take on significant commitments as an example of why they don't have to. So it erodes confidence in the international process. So that's probably its major implication, because as Martijn said earlier, they would be captured under the broader agreement. And if you think of the two main reasons why they're withdrawn is A, the compliance problem that they've got, because as they would say that the previous government hadn't put in a plan to meet their target, and the emissions from tar sands have gone through the roof. And their second major problem is that they would move in symmetry with the United States, and the US's challenge with an international agreement is that it hasn't had legal symmetry with China, and this new international agreement would overcome that. So you'd expect them all to start moving together.
Okay, and I guess there's been a comment that, as you said, undermines the process. And maybe Martijn, I mean, does this mean that a legally binding agreement post 2020 can still be undermined by people taking unilateral action to withdraw? And does it matter?
Well, I agree with all the comments that Erwin has said, but I think that it is disappointing that Canada's withdrawn, but it hasn't withdrawn because it's not committed to reducing emissions. I mean, while Canada has obviously got issues around tar sands, it has got a commitment at Copenhagen, and it really, for Canada, it's a financial issue. I mean, if it stays part of Kyoto, the penalties it has to pay are hugely significant, and one could argue that rather than paying those penalties, they're better off putting it into other domestic action to abate emissions. But I think the reality of it is that international negotiations have moved to the process where they tend to be much more about high-level, bigger picture issues, and high commitments and and international agreements over targets, whereas the way in which they're implemented will increasingly be done at the domestic level. And I think one thing that will be particularly interesting is to what extent will there be a departure from the rules of, say, an international agreement and the domestic law that implements them. So one example of that is the CDM itself is quite broad, yet the Europeans have at a domestic level restricted the types of CDM projects that are eligible within the EU. So there is a possibility that we'll see an increasing modification of those international rules at the domestic level. So for the big issue in Australia, in the Australian context, of course, is to what extent will credits under the CFI, which are non-Kyoto consistent credits, actually be accepted by Australia in the future into the emissions trading scheme in Australia, and we don't know the answer to that at the moment.
Okay. I'm just going to interrupt just there, just for 2 seconds. There has been someone asking about these acronyms, and it's probably a good point, actually. Just to make that clear, the CDM is the Clean Development Mechanism, which is set up by the United Nations, which allows developed countries like Australia, like Europe, to, well, Australia not yet, but allows countries like Europe to invest in developing countries to source cheaper emissions abatement. CERs are Certified Emission Reductions, which are actually the name of those certificates created in the CDM, the Clean Development Mechanism, and other ones refer to the European units as well. And the CFI that Martijn just referred to is the Carbon Farming Initiative, which is the Australian new scheme which will allow abatement projects and emissions reductions projects in various carbon farming schemes. Let's go to a question from Helen, and she's asking, was there a lot of talk in Durban about subnational trading schemes, e.g. those pilot schemes in China, the ones in California, and the Canadian, and the possibility that that will link into the Canadian provinces? Erwin or Martijn?
Sure. I mean, I'll have a crack at that first. I mean, I think the thing about what's happened at the international negotiations is there are two things going on. Firstly, there are the international negotiation processes themselves, which are taking place both in the main UNFCCC meeting room as well as the meetings around the side. But in addition to that, you have many governments and private sector participants presenting on various activities that are going on. So if you go onto the UNFCCC website, you'll see a 150-page list of all the side events that were going on every day. So every day somebody will be presenting, and around the main conference centre you've got the Canadian pavilion, the EU pavilion, the American pavilion, the South American pavilion. You've got all these different areas that people are presenting on what they're doing domestically or what's going on in red. You also had a large exhibition hall where a lot of international organisations were, like the Global Carbon Capture and Storage Institute and others, were presenting what they were doing in this area, as well as certain countries. So all the time there were different presentations going on what different actors in the global climate change community are doing. And you know, I mean, it's interesting that if you are someone who, you know, would think there's nothing going on in the world, you only need to spend 2 days in Durban to see that there's just so much activity all over the place. And I think what we think at the moment is that it's a little bit like it was when Kyoto was first coming onto the scene, in that you had at that point a lot of government-based and international activity going on to generate new ideas and concepts, a lot of focus on things like RED, land use, agriculture, national action mitigation plans, electric vehicles, sort of new motor vehicles, carbon capture and storage, a whole sort of suite of activities. And there's just, you know, there is so much information events going on around the COP that, that yes, there was a lot of talk about that. And at the same time, you know, you had Minister Combe was having bilateral meetings with other governments about how the Australian scheme could link.
Erwin, can I ask you a question, the next one? And this is a one wondering how cynical Canada will be. They've quit the Kyoto protocol for, this is from Patricia, quit the Kyoto protocol for the first commitment period. Could they be really cynical and come back in and join the second commitment period at a later date?
So you have to repeat the question, Giles.
Sorry, I'm just wondering whether Canada could be really cynical and leave the first commitment period of Kyoto as it has, because it wants to avoid costs, I think, of about $8 billion. Actually, I think it might be $13 billion. Could it be really cynical and then just rejoin Kyoto, the second commitment period, at a later time?
No, I'm not sure that institutionally it actually could do that, and this is one of the questions that will confront Australia. Because, and I'm not sure, and Martijn might be able to be clear on this than I am, but the process they've effectively established for defining the next round of commitments under the Kyoto Protocol will effectively end next year in December in Qatar. And then countries will go away and decide on not to ratify those amendments. So that would mean that Canada, if it was going to rejoin, would actually have to redeposit its instrument, I think, but also put in a target in May next year for its second commitment period. It's no point, there won't be a third commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol because everyone will be then covered under the same instrument, is the broad expectation post-2020. So yeah, that's pretty unlikely, but it does have implications for Australia. So Australia has said that it would be prepared to take on a second commitment period target consistent with domestic processes, is the footnote that they've used, plus depending on the decision associated with the other track. And part of the issues that will be associated with the Kyoto Protocol, if it is a 2020 target, where the commitment period goes for 8 years, which I think is probably fairly likely, then there is no current adjustment procedure under the protocol which would allow a country to increase its ambition in the middle of a commitment period. Like under the Montreal Protocol, which is designed to protect us from the hole in the ozone layer, countries can increase their level of ambition unilaterally. in a commitment period. Under the Kyoto Protocol, you can't. You would have to, every other country would have, you could try and increase your ambition, but then every other country would have to ratify it. And that's one of the problems with the protocol. So the EU and Australia pushed for amendments in Durban to actually allow that to happen. But it does mean that if a country is going to increase its ambition, it would probably need to do it next year. And if it wants to be under the second commitment period, it needs to make that decision next year.
Okay. Next question, and this is from Tam. Tam, you've got a whole bunch of questions there. I'm going to answer some of them very quickly for you now. Yes, Qatar has been confirmed for 2012. The costs for Canada are around about $13 billion, and yes, it's mostly because tar sands has pushed them over their the original Kyoto pledge. Your other question, though, is an interesting one, and it goes to if the current CO2 atmospheric levels are 390 going towards 400 and 350 is considered safe. Well, some people say 350. I think the agreed target is 450. Whatever the case, why has the Durban negotiations fallen so far short? Martijn, why are the talks still so far below what everyone recognises is needed?
Because they can't agree, basically. It's been an international negotiation, and people are still agreeing, and you know that's the real politic of international negotiations. I think there is the truth is that some level of global climate change is irreversible. It will happen, and we know we have to just push ahead and get as much done as we can to limit the impact.
Okay.
Erwin might have a comment.
Erwin?
Yeah, it's fun. It is the challenge that we have over the next little while, because while in theory you could lock in the Cancun pledges that we've currently got and then redirect to a level which some people would consider safe. That's fairly risky because of the feedbacks in the climate system, which might make it impossible in the future to actually redirect. And also you'd have to reduce emissions very, very, very quickly to achieve the long-term targets, and still, if you started more slowly, early on. So, and this is why the review in 2013 to 2015 will be really important, because we'll see a new assessment of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. We will see an increasingly robust international discussion around the level of action that countries are taking. We will have starting to see the reports coming in that have been agreed in Durban on the level of action that countries are taking, what their emissions are, how they're tracking, and so forth. So you're basically in that sort of 2013 to 2015 period, you're going to increasingly see a focus on the ambition, and whether that leads to an increase in ambition, we can't really say yet.
Yeah. Let's move on to the next question from Sue, and she asks, was there any discussion on soil carbon?
Not that I was aware of, but Martijn might have a question. But the thing to note on the rules that were agreed under the Kyoto Protocol for land use change and forestry effectively, from my recollection, kept the accounting rules for soil carbon much the same. They made mandatory accounting for forest management and set in train a process for how countries would or would not be accountable for emissions from forest management. But they, from my recollection, effectively kept the soil carbon rules the same.
Martijn, anything to add?
No, I mean, I did see one or two side events where it was sort of being discussed, but not in any great detail.
Okay. Here's a question from Tony. There have been lots of criticisms of the assumptions in the new Australian policy regarding level and cost of buying international credits. What, if any, are the direct implications from Durban in this regard? Maybe you first, Martijn.
Well, I think, yeah, we sort of answered that before. I mean, I think the whole reason for international credits being part of the Australian domestic trading scheme so that business can access an international market to buy credits that are hopefully less expensive than Australian government-issued permits, so that the cost to business is less. I mean, the principle with the CDM is that no matter where you reduce emissions in the world, it's still a reduction in global emissions. The ultimate impact of what's inside in Durban on those markets is really more about, to what extent. So under the Australian scheme, it's possible after 2015 to buy CERs, ERUs, and AAUs, which are the different types of international instruments of carbon credits, in effect, that can be bought at an international level. But because of the uncertainty of how Kyoto plays out and who is a party to it, the actual existence of some of those units very much depends upon how Kyoto is ultimately resolved, and that remains to be seen. So I think that in the case of the CDM, there's a high degree of certainty that CERs will continue to be available, but whether or not you can go into Europe and buy AAUs and use them in Australia, or things like that, in the future, depending on how the government legislation pans out, really, there's still a lot of uncertainty about that. I mean, for example, Australia is not part of a second commitment period. It cannot of itself generate Australian-based credits under what's called the joint implementation mechanism and sell them internationally.
And I think the other thing to add to that is that what we saw outside the Kyoto Protocol on markets was an explicit recognition in the decisions that were made that countries would and could unilaterally, bilaterally, plurilaterally go away and develop their own mechanisms. And that we will now embark on a process to define some frameworks around how new mechanisms under the Convention and the new treaty that would be agreed in 2015 would operate. But I think one of the things that you see if you go through all the parts of the decisions that were made in Durban, and in good part due to the activities of the Australian government, none of the doors have been shut on using emissions from deforestation, reductions in emissions from deforestation in developing countries in new mechanisms, and an explicit recognition, as I've said, that new mechanisms will be developed outside the UN framework.
Okay, look, we've got just a couple more questions, and we'll try and keep the answers a bit brief because we're almost out of time. How far away are we from trade sanctions against non-cooperating nations? Ask Michael. Erwin?
Oh, well, it's a good question. I think it's hard. It's a really impossible one to answer. I think the more important, in some respects, or more interesting question is the problem in part that we have with the Kyoto framework is it actually creates a disincentive to participate. Because the compliance regime is strict, you're seeing a situation where you currently have with Canada where it actually withdraws from the treaty as opposed to just working to become compliant with it, because it does have some fairly strict compliance regime. The challenge for the new regime, which is negotiated by 2015, will be to ensure that it creates incentives for countries to participate, as opposed to bashing them if they don't. Because what we've seen internationally is that regimes that create incentives to participate as opposed to just bashing people actually generally work better. And there's a whole range of ways you can do that, and that, I think, fundamentally will be the challenge over the next couple of years. Because the last thing we want is to come to an agreement in 2015 and we start to see countries peeling off and not ratifying. So we need to create a regime which creates incentives to participate, and the carbon markets is a good way to do that.
Martijn,
well, the only thing I was going to add one comment is that I think we're a long way away from trade sanctions, except potentially in the case of the EU airlines dispute, and a decision on the EU position by the European Court of Justice should be handed down next Wednesday.
Okay, we'll watch out for that. Can I just ask you one other question, Martijn, which is why do we persist then with the United Nations talks? Wouldn't it just be easy to get the major emitters in a room, sorted out, maybe over a couple of years, and just do away with the UN process, which is just so difficult? You need support from 194 nations. Why do we persist with UN?
That's a much bigger picture, philosophical question, Giles, which I can't really answer for you today. But I think that it's the way in which international negotiations take place to get international agreements. There's been a lot of criticism about it, and I just think, look, at this point in time, we need every process, whether it's G20, whether it's Kyoto. There's nothing to stop countries taking their own action. There's nothing to stop the G20 taking its own action. But I think the point is that everybody, it's a little bit of a prisoner's dilemma here, that everybody is expecting everyone else to take action, and so it seems the only way to do that is through an international process.
Yeah.
And it's also countries aren't prepared to give up the legitimacy of the UN because it actually suits their interests geopolitically as well. You know, the Chinas and the Brazilians, while they're increasingly operating separately from G77 and China, they still use that forum as a way to push back geopolitically against the US and others. So, and the US does the same thing. So there are incentives for countries to maintain in the process.
And one final question from each of you, an answer from each of you is, we seem to be heading towards a scenario where the world will have to take very quick and dramatic action to avoid the most dangerous aspects of climate change. Do you still see a scenario where that dramatic action will actually occur? Martijn, very quickly.
I have to be an optimistic, and I hope that it will occur. And I hope that what's happened in Durban will create an acceleration at the domestic level, and that we will be able to take action, and there'll also be some significant technology leaps that will help us get there. If we don't, then unavoidable climate change of a significant nature is going to happen. And while it may not impact so significantly many people on this call, it will heavily impact on the generations to come.
Erwin?
Yeah, well, I think in my job you have to be a professional optimist, and I think the megatrends are all heading in the right direction. We are seeing an increasing amount of domestic action. We are seeing political constituencies being built for action as a result of that. The obvious example is we're seeing the emergence of the renewable energy industry as a major global player in the energy industry. And we are actually starting to see it is astonishing that you had an agreement in Durban which had all the major economies putting aside their self-interest to an extent and agreeing to negotiate a treaty. And we shouldn't underestimate the significance of that. So I think the megatrends are heading in the right direction. Whether they're heading there fast enough, I think they're not. And really the question is for Australia and those countries who want to see more ambition is the role that they play in driving that ambition, or do they continue to sit with the laggards?
Terrific. Look, we'll have to leave it there. Once again, thanks very much, Erwin Jackson, Deputy CEO of the Climate Institute, and Martijn Wilder, the head of the Global Climate Change Practice with Baker McKenzie. Thank you both very much. That was very insightful and informative. Thank you, everyone, for listening. The webinar will be up on the website soon. You'll be able to see the slides and listen to it again, and we look forward to seeing you again. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for Shell too for sponsoring it as well. So thank you very much. We'll see you next time.